Hey, you're back with Animal Attacks. Today, I'll be covering people who trusted dangerous animals a little too much, beginning with a Florida man who hand fed an illegal capped alligator. It was June 2nd, 2014. A rural property outside a small central Florida town had a shallow runoff pond behind the house, the kind dug years ago just to handle drainage. Somewhere along the way, that pond stopped being drainage and turned into something else entirely. Kenny Madsen was 51, a welder who had kept an American alligator in that pond for almost 8 years. It started in a plastic tub in his garage and eventually became far too large for a backyard pond. Kenny never had a permit for it. His cousin helped around the property from time to time, and neighbors later said they had often seen Kenny wade into the shallow end with chicken parts, feeding it by hand since it was barely 3 feet long. Feeding an alligator by hand for years does something you might not expect. The animal keeps growing, obviously, but so does its confidence around the exact routine. American alligators are opportunistic. They learn patterns fast when food is involved, and once an alligator connects a specific person with a specific outcome at a specific time, size stops being the only thing that matters. Kenny's cousin told investigators afterward that the alligator's behavior around feeding time had changed over the final year. It had started closing distance faster, lifting higher out of the water before the food even came out, sometimes lunging toward the bucket itself instead of waiting for Kenny to throw something. Kenny brushed it off as the animal just getting bigger and hungrier. Is that not usually how these stories start? Not with some dramatic warning sign, just a slow shift that gets explained away one excuse at a time. By that spring, the alligator was already enormous, though nobody had taken an actual measurement while Kenny was alive. He kept doing what he had always done, wading in knee-deep with the bucket, tossing pieces close enough for it to grab, sometimes letting it take a piece almost straight from his fingers if it came up slow enough to trust. On the evening of June 2nd, Kenny went out alone to feed it, same as most evenings. His cousin was not there that day. A neighbor next door was doing yard work when he heard a heavy splash, then water hitting hard against the bank. Trees blocked his view of the pond, and Kenny made plenty of noise during feedings, so it did not immediately sound like an emergency. A short shout followed, then everything went quiet. The neighbor assumed Kenny had slipped in the mud or was dealing with the alligator the way he usually did. People yell at animals. People yell when they slip. About 20 minutes later, Kenny did not pick up a call from his cousin, who tried him twice in a row out of habit more than worry. That is when the neighbor decided to walk over and check, mostly because the quiet afterward felt different than the usual quiet. What he found was the feeding bucket knocked over near the pond's edge, chicken parts scattered across the mud, and one of Kenny's boots half buried at the waterline. Drag marks ran from the shallow feeding area straight into deeper water, wide and disturbed, cutting through the mud in a single continuous path rather than footprints walking back out. No sign of Kenny anywhere on the surface. He called emergency services right away. Divers recovered Kenny later that evening near the far side of the pond, well beyond his usual feeding spot. The wounds and drag marks pointed to an initial bite across his right forearm and upper torso, followed by a pull into deeper water that left him unable to reach the bank. The medical examiner listed drowning as the cause of death, with severe bite wounds as major contributing injuries. Evidence included the overturned bucket, chicken parts in the mud, drag marks, Kenny's boot at the waterline, his cousin's unanswered calls, and the neighbor's account of the splash and shout. Wildlife officers removed the alligator from the pond later that night and measured it at just over 11 feet. It was euthanized following the confirmed fatal attack. Kenny's property was cited for illegal possession of a dangerous animal, the pond was drained, and the case was closed as a fatal attack involving an unlawfully kept alligator. Kenny spent years teaching that alligator exactly when it was safe to come close to him. It just turned out the timing was never really his to control in the first place. In East Texas, a man who raised a lion from a cub stopped using the feeding chute and carried food inside the enclosure himself. until the animal pinned him beside the feeding area. It was April 14th, 2018. A rural property in East Texas held a small house, a converted barn, and a chain link enclosure built for a full-grown male lion. The lion had lived there for 6 years, raised from a cub by the man who owned the place. Justine Carson was 46, an exotic animal enthusiast who had collected large cats for years. He held a state permit to keep and exhibit exotic animals, and occasionally allowed small groups to visit the property, but most of the daily work stayed with him. Every evening, he fed the lion through a metal chute built into the side of the enclosure. The setup was straightforward. Justine loaded food from outside, shut the metal door, and the lion ate in its own section. Sliding gates separated the feeding area from the holding space and outdoor run. Nobody had to be inside with a hungry lion. Somewhere over time, Justine started treating the chute as inconvenient. His adult son later told investigators that Justine had begun carrying the food bucket inside and placing it near the lion's feeding area himself. He had done it enough times without incident that it became the new normal. I have never understood why people call something a pet once it gets too dangerous to touch. At that point, pet is doing a lot of work as a word. A lion can recognize a person and still hurt them. That is the uncomfortable part of privately owned big cats. Familiarity changes how close the animal lets you get, but it does not turn a 400-pound predator into something domestic. Around food, space, and routine matter, and a lion can cross a small enclosure faster than anyone standing inside can react. In the months before April, the lion had become more vocal around feeding. Justine's son said the animal paced the inner fence before meals and growled when the food bucket appeared. He had also started hitting the chain link with his forepaws, especially when feeding ran late. Justine called it normal behavior from an older male and continued with the same routine. Later that day, Justine took the bucket out while his son stayed in the barn repairing a water line. Before the attack, the son could hear the lion pacing along the inner fence, moving back and forth in the same direction as the food bucket. It was louder than usual, but the son did not go out because Justine had fed the lion through that behavior before. Then came the roar, followed by the sharp sound of the metal bucket striking concrete. The son ran to the enclosure and looked through the mesh panel beside the gate. Justine was down near the feeding area. The lion had one forepaw pressed across his chest and shoulder, holding him against the concrete. Its jaws were clamped around the side of Justine's neck and upper torso. Justine was moving at first, using both hands to push at the lion's head and jaw, but the animal's weight kept him pinned. The lion shifted its grip once, while the son watched, pulling Justine several inches across the concrete toward the food bucket. That movement left a visible blood trail beneath him. The son did not enter. He activated the exterior alarm, contacted emergency services, and struck the outside fencing with a metal bar in an attempt to pull the lion's attention away. The lion released Justine and moved toward the food bucket at the far end of the enclosure. The son stayed outside the gate. Animal officers arrived with deputies and used the enclosure's sliding gate system to lure the lion into the secondary holding area with meat, then lock it behind the partition. Only after that could responders reach Justine. He was still alive, but the wounds to his neck and chest had caused major blood loss. He died during transport to medical care. The examination found crush trauma to the neck and upper torso, along with deep bite wounds that caused massive blood loss. Investigators documented the feeding chute, which was still fully functional, and the son's statement that Justine had stopped using it months earlier. The lion was transferred to a secure animal facility, and the property lost its permit to exhibit exotic animals. That feeding chute was never meant to make Justine's life harder. It was there so he would never have to share space with a hungry lion. Over at a private home in Missouri, a woman prepared fruit for the chimpanzee she had raised since infancy, unaware the enclosure latch was about to leave her on the wrong side of the door. It was October 9th, 2019. A quiet property outside a small Missouri town had a house with a reinforced room connected to the kitchen, built for a chimpanzee that had grown far beyond anything a normal home was meant to hold. Eva Meyer was 58, originally from Germany, and had lived in the United States for years. She got the chimpanzee as an infant through a private breeder and raised him herself from there. In his early years, she dressed him in small outfits and let visitors take photos through the front window, which made him something of a local curiosity. She called him family, and feeding him had become one more ordinary part of her day. By then, the animal had lived in that house longer than many of the neighbors had known Eva. Her friend, Marlene, had come over that afternoon for coffee and was sitting at the kitchen table while Eva prepared fruit and vegetables in bowls beside the enclosure room. Marlene later told investigators the chimp had been more vocal than usual that day, pacing along the interior fencing and slapping the lower part of the feeding hatch whenever Eva moved near the food. She had suggested waiting until the animal settled down before bringing the bowls over, but Eva continued with the usual feeding routine. Adult chimpanzees are far stronger than people give them credit for. An adult male can pull an adult person off balance with one arm, and their teeth do not just puncture, they tear. Once a chimp is fully grown, raising it from infancy does not mean you have removed any of that. It just means the person has spent years getting used to being close. I think that is one of the hardest things about animals raised in homes. The danger does not arrive suddenly. It grows up in the next room, 1 pound and 1 year at a time. Eva slid open the feeding hatch to pass the bowls through. It was designed to lock once the food was inside, but the latch did not fully engage. The opening was too narrow for the chimpanzee to climb through, but wide enough for him to reach well into the kitchen. The failed latch did not have to release the animal to put Eva in danger. Marlene heard the metal panel bang and turned in time to see the chimp force an arm through the opening. It caught Eva's left wrist and pulled hard. The force folded Eva against the counter edge beside the hatch, then dropped her onto the tile within reach of the service opening. The chimp's teeth closed across Eva's hand and wrist first. When she tried to pull free, it caught her forearm, then tore high into the upper left arm, damaging the brachial artery. Eva turned her face away and raised her right hand, but the chimp reached through again, biting her fingers and the side of her cheek. Marlene backed into the hallway, called emergency services, and dragged a heavy kitchen cart between Eva and the hatch. During the struggle, the food bowls tipped across the enclosure floor. The chimp shifted back toward them for a moment, and Marlene used that opening to pull Eva into the hallway and shut the kitchen door. She pressed towels against Eva's upper arm while giving the address and explaining that the chimp was moving freely inside the enclosure room connected to the kitchen. Eva was conscious at first, but could not speak clearly because of the facial injury. Her hands, arms, and shirt were covered in blood. Paramedics reached the property and brought Eva out through the front entrance while officers secured the house. She lost consciousness during transport and died shortly after reaching medical care. The examination found fatal blood loss from injuries to the upper left arm, both hands, and both forearms. The brachial artery injury was identified as the main source of bleeding. The failed hatch latch, blood patterned through the kitchen and hallway, food bowls on the enclosure floor, and Marlene's account established what happened. The case was closed as a fatal captive chimpanzee attack, with the failed service hatch and Eva's decision to feed the animal at close range identified as the main safety failures. The chimpanzee was removed from the property and transferred to a secure primate facility. Eva's home was later found to have multiple outdated modifications that no longer met private primate containment standards. The facility's permit was revoked, and the property was no longer allowed to exhibit exotic animals. A long history with an animal can feel like proof that you understand it. Sometimes it only proves you have been lucky so far. From a Missouri kitchen to a Texas big cat facility, where an owner knew the sliding door was unreliable and still started his cleaning routine alone. It was February 28th, 2020. A private big cat facility outside a small Texas town held several animals in outdoor enclosures with attached indoor holding sections. One section housed a full-grown Bengal tiger, separated from the cleaning area by a heavy guillotine-style sliding door. Mitch Stan had spent more than 20 years collecting exotic cats by the time this happened. At 63, he still handled the tiger's daily care himself, including the cleaning. Each morning, He moved the animal into its indoor section, shut the sliding door, and cleaned the outer space with a hose and cart. The assistant usually arrived later, after Mitch had already finished the first part of the work. The assistant had offered more than once to take over the cleaning when Mitch was working alone, but Mitch usually preferred to start early and get it done before anyone else arrived. That morning, he had planned to finish the tiger's enclosure before a small group was due to visit later in the day. The assistant was scheduled to arrive shortly after opening, but Mitch started the work early rather than waiting for the second person to be on site. The visitor schedule did not cause the door failure, but it gave Mitch one more reason to start before the assistant arrived. All of that depended on one thing: the sliding door actually closing and locking when it was supposed to. The part-time assistant had noticed it sticking for weeks. Sometimes it stopped short of the floor and needed an extra push before the latch caught. Mitch knew about it. He had said he would replace the track when the facility had a quieter month, but he kept using the same door and relying on a quick look from outside. I have watched people trust a piece of equipment because it worked yesterday. That is a normal way to think around a lawnmower or a truck. It is a terrible gamble when that failed part is attached to a tiger enclosure. A full-grown tiger does not need an open gate to become dangerous. It only needs access to the wrong side of a containment barrier. In a confined cleaning area, there is no distance to create, no vehicle to climb into, and no safe way to physically take control back once the animal is through. Later that morning, the assistant arrived after Mitch had begun the cleaning routine. The cleaning cart was tipped over near the holding area entrance, and the guillotine door was still partly raised instead of locked in place. The assistant could hear the tiger moving inside, but he could not see Mitch clearly through the mesh. Later inspection showed the door had stopped several inches above the track, leaving enough room for the tiger to force into the cleaning side. He stayed outside the enclosure, contacted emergency responders, and waited for the dangerous animal team to arrive. They used the exterior transfer point to lure the tiger into the indoor section with food, then secured the sliding door from outside before anyone entered the cleaning area. Mitch was found near the back wall, several feet from the cleaning cart. The hose had been pulled across the floor, and fresh scrape marks ran along the concrete, where he appeared to have tried to move away from the doorway. The cart, the partially raised door, and damage around the track all pointed to the tiger forcing into the cleaning space after the latch failed. Mitch's injuries included a crushing bite to the side of his neck and deep wounds to his chest and shoulder. He had died before the assistant arrived. The medical examination listed neck crush, trauma, and blood loss as the cause of death. Investigators documented the defective door track, maintenance notes from the assistant, and the lack of a second locking mechanism. The state closed the facility after finding that the defective containment door had remained in use despite repeated concerns. The tiger was moved to a secure, accredited sanctuary, and the enclosure was later dismantled. I have worked around enough equipment to know how easy it is to put off a small repair. A door sticks, a latch needs checking, and next month starts sounding close enough. That logic falls apart when the door is the only thing separating you from a tiger. From a Texas tiger enclosure to rural Florida, where a handler wrote a safety rule for Jaguar transfers, then broke it on the one day his second person called out sick. It was August 11th, 2022. A rural Florida property held a small collection of exotic cats under a state exhibitor license. The enclosures sat behind the owner's house, linked by narrow transfer tunnels used for cleaning, veterinary checks, and moving animals between sections. Felipe Duarte was 52, a Brazilian-born animal handler who had worked at the property for several years. When the Jaguar had to be moved, he was usually the one setting up the transfer. He had put the two-person rule in writing after a close call with another cat years earlier. One handler watched through the viewing panel, while the other worked the external doors so the animal could move from one section to the next without anyone standing in the tunnel with it. A Jaguar transfer is not like feeding through a fence. The animal is confined, the space is narrow, and every opening matters. Jaguars have an unusually powerful bite for their size, capable of crushing bone and holding on through repeated movement. A single mistake in a tunnel can leave a person with no room to retreat and no barrier between them and the animal. I can see why the tunnels feels manageable when you are standing outside it with the controls in your hand. A few feet of metal and mesh can make a dangerous animal look like a problem you have already solved. Felipe's second handler called out sick that morning. A volunteer later said Felipe considered postponing the enclosure cleaning, but he planned to finish it before a small visitor group arrived later that day. He chose to handle the transfer himself. The exterior camera covered only the entrance end of the transfer tunnel. It recorded Felipe opening the first shift door and guiding the Jaguar toward the rear enclosure with a pole from outside the gate. The cat entered the tunnel, then stopped halfway through. To clear the tunnel, Felipe opened the service side door and stepped into the narrow corridor himself. The camera recorded the Jaguar turning back before the second door had been secured. The rest came from the video, the door positions, damage inside the tunnel, and Felipe's injuries. The Jaguar came back through the narrow passage before Felipe could get out. Scrape marks on the inner wall and a broken handling pole found beneath him showed he had tried to turn and create space, but there was nowhere to move. The injury pattern suggested the Jaguar first caught Felipe high across the left side of his face and head, driving him into the tunnel wall. Additional punctures across his upper chest and shoulder were consistent with a second bite as he went down. Blood transfer marks and the depth of the shoulder wounds indicated the Jaguar remained over him briefly before moving through the open shift door into the rear section. A volunteer arrived minutes later and noticed the transfer light still on. Looking through the exterior panel, she saw Felipe down beside the tunnel entrance and the Jaguar moving in the rear enclosure. She triggered the emergency alarm and stayed outside the perimeter. Another worker came from the house and used the external shift controls to close the Jaguar into the rear section. Only after the locks were checked did they enter the transfer corridor. Felipe was alive when they reached him. He had deep punctures across his chest and shoulder, severe facial trauma, and a head injury from the Jaguar's crushing bite. The workers used trauma dressings and kept pressure on the chest wound while one of them contacted emergency responders. He lost consciousness before help arrived. Paramedics continued treatment at the property, but he was pronounced dead before transport could begin. The medical findings identified traumatic brain injury from bites to the head and face, with extensive blood loss from the chest and shoulder wound. Camera footage, the shift door positions, and Felipe's written safety plan established that he had entered the transfer corridor alone, contrary to the facility's own rule. The state suspended the exhibitor license and required the remaining animals to be moved while the property was reviewed. The Jaguar was transferred to a larger accredited facility, and the transfer tunnel was dismantled as part of the closure process. A place can have gates, cameras, and paperwork, but none of it matters if the person in charge starts treating the risky part like another chore. At a rural Georgia home, a man who trusted his dogs completely had a medical episode near their feeding bowls, and the hours afterward told the rest of the story. It was November 19th, 2013. A rural Georgia property sat behind a line of pine trees with a small house, a reinforced outdoor enclosure, and one full-grown leopard that spent most of its days in the shaded run outside. The feeding station sat at the far end of the enclosure, away from the house where meat could be placed and the tray rinsed after each meal. Floyd Dillard was 61 and lived alone with the leopard he had raised since it was a cub. He had acquired the animal through a private exotic animal breeder and kept it for nearly 11 years. His sister lived nearby and checked on him regularly, so she knew his mornings by heart. He fed the leopard first, then went inside to make breakfast for himself. Most days, she said, he would call her sometime after 9 with some complaint about the leopard knocking over its feeding tray or dragging food across the enclosure. The leopard had never been treated as exhibition stock alone. Floyd knew where it preferred to sleep, spent time beside the enclosure, and had raised it from infancy. His sister said he talked about it the way most people talk about a family pet, always with a story about something the animal had done that week. Floyd had a history of heart trouble. 2 days before this happened, his sister said he mentioned tightness in his chest during a phone call. She encouraged him to get checked out, but he did not make an appointment. On the morning of November 19th, he entered the enclosure to feed the leopard as usual. No one saw the first moments inside. The picture came together from the feeding station, the injuries, and the condition of the ground around Floyd. The feeding bucket was still partly full, beside the fence, with several pieces of meat scattered across the dirt. A set of scuff marks led from the feeding area to where he was found. His shirt had been pulled up and torn at the back, with dirt ground into the fabric near both shoulders. The evidence suggested Floyd went down near the feeding station and tried to move toward the gate. Blood staining on the ground began close to the tray, then continued in a broken trail across the enclosure. The first bite appeared to have landed across his shoulder, with additional wounds to his forearms and torso, consistent with him raising his arms while on the ground. A leopard remains dangerous, even when it has known the same person for years. If that person suddenly falls inside the enclosure, they lose the distance and control that kept the routine manageable. Floyd had spent years feeding the animal while standing upright. Once he was on the ground, he had no practical way to protect himself. Floyd's sister arrived later that morning after he stopped answering calls. She found the enclosure gate shut, the leopard moving restlessly around the feeding area, and the overturned bucket visible through the fencing. She did not enter. She called emergency services from outside the enclosure and waited until animal officers arrived. Responders secured the leopard inside its attached holding area and found Floyd near the gate, several yards from the feeding tray. He had injuries across his shoulder, both forearms, and his torso. He was already dead by the time they reached him. The medical examination listed exsanguination from multiple leopard-inflicted bite wounds as the cause of death. Floyd's heart condition was noted as a possible contributing factor, since the evidence suggested he may have collapsed or become unable to defend himself before the leopard attacked, but the exact sequence could not be proven. Investigators reviewed the sister's recent phone call, the feeding area, the bucket position, the bite patterns, and the leopard's history. There was no record of the animal attacking a person before that morning. The leopard was transferred to a secure exotic animal facility while local authorities completed their review of the case. This is the one that feels different from the others. Floyd was not trying to prove anything or deliberately provoke a predator. His heart gave out while he was feeding the leopard he had treated like family, leaving him on the ground with no way to protect himself.